Hello again, and welcome back to our mini-series on playing the acoustic guitar in worship. If you haven't checked out the previous introductory video on the role of the acoustic guitar, I'd really encourage you to go back and check that out first, because the idea is that we'll be building on knowledge gained throughout this series from video to video. In this video, we're going to be looking at capos and chord shapes. I'm going to take you through some of the basic chords, and then I'm going to show you how they relate to something called the Nashville numbering system. We'll then look at the capo, how it can help and unfortunately sometimes hinder our playing, and then we'll look at that in relation to some other useful chord shapes. Now, you've probably noticed that by now, worship music generally does not use the most complex range of chords. There's a reason for this. It's to ensure accessibility and replicability, okay? To make it more straightforward for us normal people to play them in our homes and then in our churches. I'm not going to take you through all the different chords because I only know about 5. And I'm not going to take you through all of that, but I do want you to show you some of the more common chords and match them up to the Nashville numbering system. So let's take one of the most common sequences in worship music. Let's take G, C, E minor, D. Now, with those 4 chords, you can play most worship songs. And if a songwriter is really looking to spice things up, they might go a bit wild and throw in an A minor, and then a slightly harder chord that I sometimes play wrong, a B minor. Now, the great thing about the acoustic guitar is that you can just sit in your bedroom, and this is what I did to learn acoustic guitar, and just practice those chords over and over and over again, gradually getting more smooth in terms of your transitions over time. But in a relatively short space of time, you'll be able to start playing along with worship songs. Now, applying this into a band context, at Birmingham Vineyard, we found something called the Nashville numbering system, a really helpful way to communicate what chords we are playing. So essentially, the numbers in this system replace the letters. So let's go back to this sequence. So we've got G. Now we're playing in the key of G. G is the root, the G is the root chord, so that will be the 1. So G becomes 1. And then everything else is relative to that root chord. So next chord in the sequence is the C. That then becomes the 4. Next chord is the D. 1 tone higher is the 5. The 6 is the E minor. And then our slightly more complicated chords, A minor and B minor. The A minor is the 2 and the B minor is the 3. If you want to know more about that system, there's some really great resources that are available to you in our training folders that will explain it more fully. But to give you the basic reasons of why we use that, it really eases communication among the band. On a Sunday morning, the MD will be able to shout out the numbers and you will know what to play. It will also help us as musicians commit the chords to memory. And actually, the better we know the chords of the song, the more instinctive your playing will become. And that allows you to focus less on chord changes and focus on other aspects of your playing. Your strumming, if you're singing along, you can focus on your singing as well. It's a really helpful system. So spend some time at home practicing and linking those chords to those numbers. It is something that you will have to practice in the comfort of your own home. Remember, we've got the G, the 1, the C, the 4, E minor, the 6, and 5 the D. Now on the point of that 6, the E minor, in worship, that will generally be a minor chord. So you might see it as written as 6M with a lowercase m. Similarly, in most worship songs, unless they're really pushing the boat out, the 2 and the 3 will generally be minor. So if we're playing in G, okay, it will generally be A minor, B minor. So 2M and 3M. Now, sometimes a worship songwriter will want to add some variations to a song by bringing in slightly different forms of chords. probably the most common variation, or at least one of them, is to add a third to the chord. So you've probably seen, if you've looked at chord sheets, a chord that is G/B. It's not what I thought when I first started playing guitar, where you've got to play G and then really quickly play B. Don't do that, it doesn't sound good. Actually, what it means is that you're typically playing the G, but you're ensuring that actually, instead of having the G as the root there, you've got a prominent B as the lowest note. So you can hear it there coming through on my A string. In Nashville numbering, that G over B would then be shown as a 1/3. Similarly, a C/E, with the E in the root, would be a 4/6, or 4/6. Or a D/F sharp would be a 5/7. Now, like me, you've probably experienced the joy of becoming vaguely comfortable with G-shaped chords and realised to your great joy that you can play along with songs, even if they're in a different key, by using one of these, a capo. Here's one I borrowed earlier because I forgot mine. Key lesson for acoustic guitarists, always remember your capo. Now, these are simultaneously the guitarist's best friend, but also their worst enemy. It's really important, like any tool, that we use them well and use them for the appropriate purpose. Essentially, in my layman's explanation, placing this capo on the fretboard will shorten, effectively, the length of the string, okay, resulting in higher pitch from each string. Now, there's a few things to think about when we place the capo on our fretboard. The position matters, because the position of the capo affects the tone and the quality of the resonance from your strings. So try to keep it as close to 90 degrees perpendicular relative to the fretboard. Try to keep it fairly closely up to the next fret. These moves will help avoid any horrible buzzing, because if you end it up in the wrong place, you can end up with some really horrible sounds. That is a particularly horrible sound. I'm impressed with how bad a sound that capo makes in the wrong place. But if you put it in the right position, it will have a lovely resonance and it will help keep your guitar in tune and keep you sounding good. The downside of this capo is that we can be tempted to use it all the time. We've been tempted to use G shapes for every single song and keep moving it up the fretboard higher and higher. And I'm speaking very much to myself here. I am guilty of doing this often. And the difficulty of doing that is, though it keeps it more straightforward for you as the acoustic guitarist, it changes the quality and the timbre of the sound. Okay? So for example, once we get higher and higher, so we head up to the stratosphere up here, we've got a very different sounding acoustic guitar. Now, this can be helpful. If you are the second acoustic, it gives you variation, okay, and it makes sure that you don't interfere and overlap with the main acoustic. But generally, when you're playing as the first acoustic, the main acoustic in the band, we want some nice middling sounds that come from lower down the fretboard. As a rule of thumb then, I would advise trying not to exceed the 5th fret with the capo. This means, I'm afraid, as I discovered, you will need to learn additional chord shapes which will develop you as a guitarist. G shapes are absolutely the right place to start out with. Okay? If that's where you're at, please spend time mastering those. They are the right place to start. But I encourage you not to get stuck with just one set of chord shapes. So for example, if we need to play in D or E, it's probably best that we use shapes other than G that will allow us to play slightly lower down the neck. I'd say with G and D chord shapes, you can play most songs using a capo. If you're looking to move beyond this, you can start thinking about how can you vary your playing. One of the things that's worth considering is how can you make your chord transitions as smooth as possible. The key answer is a boring one, it's practice, but there is another thing you can do if you are looking to minimize the amount of changes you have to make when you play a chord. So let's go back to our original pattern, our G, our C, our E minor, our D, our 1, 4, 6, 5 pattern. Now you can simplify and smooth it out by keeping your fingers in place on the B and E strings. Okay, so the top 2 strings here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave my 4th and 5th fingers on that as I play through the pattern. So G, C, E minor, and D. And a bit of variation, you can drop the little finger. Now, you don't want to always do this, okay, because it, again, could get a little bit dull if you're just doing that all the way through the set. Okay, we do want to have some variation in our playing. But if we're concerned about jauntiness in transitions, particularly when you're playing as part of a larger band and say it's in a big chorus, where there's not going to be much of your tone and pitch coming through, it's going to be more of that percussive sound, and you want to focus on a strong rhythmic style of playing, this is a really helpful thing to do. On the note of making things as smooth as possible, keep an eye out for chords that don't require all the strings to be played. This is something acoustic guitarists can neglect to do, particularly if we get caught up in the moment of worship. There's been many a Sunday where I've just been going for it in a world of my own, and I've been playing all the strings, and I shouldn't be playing all the strings, okay? Try to make sure that the notes that we're playing are in fitting with what's required by the chords. The most common culprit here is probably this naughty boy at the bottom here, the E string, okay? So, particularly when we come to C or D. We generally don't want that E string ringing out, because actually it shouldn't be in the D chord at all. And when it comes to the C, if we're playing the E string, you're actually turning it into a C over E. And it's not as fatal as some misplaced notes are, but it's not always intended. So do keep an eye out for what strings you're playing. There's possibilities if you find it a bit difficult in the worship set to start here and you don't want to be staring down at your guitar the whole time, okay? One thing you can do is mute strings. You can generally do that with your left hand. So for example, I will sometimes use my thumb to mute the E string. So I'm playing a C and actually I'm hitting that lower E, but you can't really hear it. It's got a slight harmonic, but you can't really hear it. I could also, if I'm doing more of a kind of power chord or bar chord style chord, I could use my first finger to press down some of the strings. So let's look at the B kind of power chord. Now I only want to play those 3 strings, but I can use my fingers to mute the other strings. In this case, I'm particularly muting those top 2 strings, but I'm also able to use my third finger to mute the E string. So that brings us to the end of this video. We've looked at a few different things. I hope it's been helpful. We've looked at chord patterns and how they can be linked to something called the Nashville numbering system, and we've discussed why that's really useful for us to learn and use in our worship. We've spent some time looking at the capo and how it can be the best of tools and the worst of tools, and we've discussed how to use it well. And we've looked at techniques to ensure smooth transitions between chords, but also how to ensure that we have variation in what we're playing. In the next video in our series, we're going to move a bit more to focus on the other hand. If you're right-handed, it's this one. We're going to be looking at strumming and we're going to be looking at picking. Thank you for joining us in this video, and I look forward to seeing you next time.